Dizziness, headaches, hearing loss, cognitive issues, and difficulty sleeping. The US State Department says these are some of the symptoms experienced by at least 21 embassy staffers in Havana. And they developed them after a series of attacks of an unknown nature. What started as a diplomatic mystery has now turned into a diplomatic crisis. The American embassy in Havana has cut staff, stopped issuing visas to Cubans, and US citizens have been warned against travelling to the island. The US government has also expelled 15 Cuban diplomats from Washington, D.C. over what it says is Havana's failure to protect diplomats on Cuban soil. Cuba says it has no involvement in the alleged attacks and has been fully cooperating with investigations. And the government has labelled America's response unjustified.
By these politically motivated and thoughtless actions, the U.S. government is responsible for the current and possibly future deterioration of bilateral relations.
Those relations were only fully restored in 2015, thawing out 50 years of Cold War rhetoric which had divided the countries. That rapprochement with Havana was lauded as a key foreign policy achievement of Barack Obama during his time in office. But those closer ties and the benefits that were expected to flow from them have been curtailed since Donald Trump entered the White House. Here's President Trump in June.
I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
A message he repeated last week.
We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime until it delivers full political freedom for the Cuban people.
But can there be any real prospect of improved relations while this diplomatic health mystery remains unsolved? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to debate this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by John Suarez. He's the coordinator of the Free Cuba Foundation. And in London, we have Robert Miller. He's the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign Organization. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. John Suarez, let me begin with you. The first vice president in Cuba, who will probably succeed Castro, said these events in the region prove that, quote, imperialism can never be trusted, not even a tiny bit, never. I'm guessing you don't trust him. Tell me why.
Well, one, I don't trust him because his regime is engaged in imperialism in the region. There are thousands of Cuban troops in Venezuela installing a totalitarian regime there with Nicolas Maduro, subverting democracy as the Venezuelan people suffer more and more. I think also with regards to the crisis with the diplomats, a lot of people tend to forget that the Cuban government has a history of treating diplomats poorly, not only American, but Canadian. In the case of the Americans, there was a case of diplomat Robin Myers in 1996 that they were throwing cars at and trying to harm her because she was meeting with dissidents. There have been other cases where diplomats have found their mouthwash replaced with urine, pets murdered, threatening phone calls. So when the foreign minister says that Cuba has never engaged in this behavior that goes counter to the Vienna Convention of guaranteeing the protection of diplomats in their home territory, that's simply not true based on the historical record. Secondly, the Cuban government has a duty, whether or not they are actually involved in what's taking place, to protect those diplomats. Failing to do that, and some of these diplomats, in addition to the hearing loss, are having memory loss or some slight brain damage, the Americans prudentially pulled out their people, 60%. The 15 Cubans that were pulled out of the U.S. was to maintain equity or reciprocity. I don't think the administration actually came out punishing them for this, but saying, listen, we had to remove X number of American diplomats, so we're going to have you draw down X number of Cuban diplomats and maintain parity.
Okay, Robert Miller, let's for the moment accept that these acoustic attacks are a real thing, whoever might be doing them. These diplomats are getting sick, something's happening. Don't you think Cuba should maybe try to figure out what's going on or own up if it is behind it rather than denying it?
Well, my understanding is very clear that the Cuban government has done everything possible to investigate these so-called sonic attacks. In fact, there's been 3 or 4 visits by FBI officers to Havana to investigate with their highest level of scientific investigations. And to date, as John rightly pointed out, there has been no evidence of these attacks having taken place. And in fact, if there was evidence, I'm sure the American government would have shown that evidence to the world. In fact, what you've got is a return to the negative trajectory of anti-Cuban accusations and aggression, which has been the modus operandi, really, of US foreign policy towards the island for over 50 years. And it's a continuation of the blockade policies, the aggressive policies against an island, which is really just standing up on its own 2 feet. It's a sovereign country, and it's trying to do the best in a very difficult world. Really, these accusations have been forwarded by some very hardline Cuban Americans led by Senator Marco Rubio, who has made it very, very clear that he wants to return back to the old Cold War rhetoric and Cold War style relationship between the United States and Cuba. And quite frankly, in 2017, we should be moving forward, not backwards at this time.
So, John Suarez, negative trajectory, as Robert Miller puts it. Is the Trump administration trashing all the goodwill that was created and massaged and finessed under Barack Obama in 2015? Sure, Cuba's not perfect, but it was going in a certain direction. Has all of it been reversed now, John?
Well, I think that we need to, first off, I'd want to say that Mr. Miller said that, there was no evidence. There are evidence of attacks. The question is there evidence of involvement of the Cuban government? The Trump administration saying that has not been established, but that there has been harm done to these diplomats, whether it be sonic or something else. That's something that's not being debated. And it wasn't Marco Rubio who came out with that. It was frustrated diplomats that leaked it to CBS News, and they were being critical of the Trump administration for keeping quiet about it. The attacks began in November of 2016. There was no response by the Obama administration when they were engaging with Cuba. They were having bilateral meetings in December. They were having meetings in January where they lifted the medical parole program for doctors that are treated as slaves in third countries. Now those doctors are having to sue in places like Brazil to try to regain their freedom when before they could come to the U.S. That's one of the legacies of the Obama administration. But furthermore, the Trump administration began responding privately to the Cuban government in February, requesting explanations with what was going on with the diplomats quietly. It was not until August, when CBS News was going to break the story, some of these diplomats over social media were complaining about what was happening to them, that the administration was forced to respond.
Right.
And then you had Marco Rubio and other people
Right.
saying this was unacceptable.
Okay.
But I'd also want to touch on one other issue. Hold
Sure.
on one moment, very quickly. On January 2nd, when they were having the review of military troops in Havana with Raul Castro in the stands, the military was chanting how they were going to shoot Barack Obama repeatedly in the head so many times they would create a lead hat. So this idea that there was some sort of positive détente between the two countries is belied by the rhetoric of the Cuban government.
Well, hold on. So, John, are you saying that Obama was duped?
I'm saying that Obama had an agenda to try to push for this détente with Cuba, despite the behavior of Cuba. During their negotiations, Cuba was caught smuggling tons of weapons trying to smuggle tons of weapons to North Korea. The freighter was intercepted in Panama. It revealed MiGs, ballistic missile technology, tons of weapons. That was in 2013 when negotiations were underway.
Right.
2014, a Hellfire missile during NATO exercises was intercepted in Europe and wound up in Cuba. The Cubans refused to return it until the Wall Street Journal broke the story in February of 2016.
As the President, John, of the United States of America, didn't he seize the moment because all the polls at the time in 2015 indicated that both sides, Americans and Cubans, wanted a better deal. They didn't want 50 years of blockade. They didn't want this anymore. Fine. Both countries maybe are imperfect. Maybe Cuba is more imperfect than the United States, but they wanted to move forward, right? All the polls indicated that. Wasn't Obama just seizing the moment?
But also the premise, hold on. President Obama's premise, first of all, is false. It hasn't been 50 years of blockade. 1977, Jimmy Carter normalized relations. He opened interest sections, which opened de facto embassies in Cuba and the United States, and he lifted the travel ban. What took place afterwards was an increase in hostility from Cuba with the increased resources, the export of revolution to places like Nicaragua, and that warming, that opening, cooled off. And you also saw with the Mariel boat lift, where Mr. Castro sprinkled criminal elements into this mass exodus, that helped sink President Carter's re-election chances in 1980. And with Ronald Reagan, there was a rollback in those policies. We saw that again repeated in the 1990s with Bill Clinton, where they opened up trade. There's been trade between Cuba and the United States since 2000, approximately $5 billion worth of trade. Paradoxically, the trade dried up during the Obama years when he was pushing for normalization.
Okay, so Robert, every time the U.S. extended the olive branch, it was the Cubans who preferred isolation, who preferred blockade.
I'm afraid that's ridiculous. The blockade has been in place for almost 60 years without fail. There have been some lightnings of some of the elements of the blockade.
What blockade, sir?
Obama
Explain to me the blockade.
Some changes. The blockade is a real blockade. It is extraterritorial. There are companies in Britain that have paid hundreds of millions of dollars of fines to the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the US Treasury, purely for their desire and their trade with Cuba. It is a blockade. It is a blockade that is condemned every year for the last 20 years at the United Nations by every single country of the world, except two, the United States and Israel. And even the United States and Israel last year abstained on that vote. So 191 countries have condemned the extraterritorial nature of the blockade that does exist and affects Cuba.
Robert,
Cuba is a sovereign country of
Robert,
just 11 million people.
A blockade, sir, is a military action with ships surrounding an island. There has not been a blockade since 1962.
Okay,
so
you disagree on whether there's a blockade or not.
sanctions.
Hold on, John, just give me a second. Robert, let me ask you...
No, it's a question of definition.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you, Robert, do you agree that the following things would be good for Cuba? Free elections in Cuba, legalization of multiple political parties, the release of political prisoners, and respect for human rights. Do you agree, Robert, that those would be good things?
Cuba is a sovereign country. It has its way of organising society.
It can decide not to have
democratic elections.
So it can decide not to have a system with any of that, and that's fine by you.
It can have its democratic system. There will be elections again next year in February, and there will be a national general election. It is very, very different.
But are you genuinely telling me, Robert, that Cuba has free elections?
Cuba has democratic elections, yes, I am telling you that. And I'll give you an example. In November this year, six members of the Cuban Parliament, MPs, members of Parliament, are coming to the British Parliament, the mother of all parliaments in our democratic country.
Let me follow through the thought.
Inter-parliamentary union, as a formal exchange between members of Parliament in Cuba and in Britain.
Okay, so it's recognised by some in Britain. Fair enough.
It's very different, but it is their system.
It's their system, so there's a relativism here. But I'm going to park that aside. Let me follow through the thought. Helms-Burton in 1996 lists those things, but according to US law, it lists those things and says, if Cuba makes movement towards those things being achieved, then we don't have to have sanctions on Cuba anymore, and we don't have to have a blockade on Cuba anymore. So that's US law. Isn't Trump just basically... So Robert, isn't Trump just basically adhering to US law, no more, no less?
Why is the world's biggest superpower unilaterally blockading another country? Why? Why is that happening? Why is the world's biggest superpower unilaterally blockading
there was a brief blockade in
Caribbean
1962. Sir, there was a brief blockade in 1962 when there were nuclear missiles placed by the Soviet Union. Since there has not been a blockade. There are economic sanctions in place. It's not true. And I also want to point out another thing. You talk about democracy. In Cuba, when the Cuban people have organized petition drives to change the law as is currently outlined in the Cuban Constitution, well, it was as of 92 and 2002. Osvaldo Payá Sardinas with the Varela Project obtained 25,000 signatures for reforms of the system to bring it in line with human rights, something popular with many Cubans. That was rejected by the regime. They locked up most of the members of that movement with sentences ranging from 15 to 28 years in prison. Their wives had to go to the streets for almost 10 years protesting, being beaten down in the streets.
With respect, you're just spouting a load of nonsense, really, one after another after
It's not
another.
nonsense. It's
the blockade
historical fact.
It existed in
You want to
61.
rewrite history.
It's
You want to say
written down
Cuba
in the
has
laws of the
democratic
United
States.
elections when it's a one-party dictatorship.
So let me change the word to embargo.
There's only one legal political party.
Okay, John.
My friend, please.
John, can I change the word to embargo? Would you accept it's an embargo, John? It's an embargo, right? Can we accept that?
I would accept that it's embargo or economic sanctions.
Okay,
but
so
definitely not a blockade.
So
a blockade
is
a very specific
okay,
thing.
So let me then.
Okay,
so I don't want to get into a semantics debate over the words, right? Let's accept it, that it's an embargo for the sake of this discussion. Let me go back to those polls that I mentioned.
Well, I'm not going to accept that Cuba's a democracy like this individual.
Exactly, and Robert, that's a very relativistic and inaccurate definition of democracy. But again, let's put that aside for a second, John. Those polls that I mentioned in 2015.
It's not an inaccurate.
Of course.
Not an inaccurate.
Come on, Robert. You can't call Cuba a democracy. It's absurd. Robert, it's absurd to call it a democracy.
Why is that absurd? Why?
You're telling me there are free and fair elections in Cuba.
The Cubans participate in elections. Yeah, I am telling you. Yeah.
Okay.
John, I'm not talking here about North Korea, are we?
John.
Look, John. You're denying a blockade that your country has your country is unilaterally imposed on another country.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to bring in John. John, I want to ask you about those polls in 2015. At the time of the deal, right, we had 59% of Republicans in the U.S. favoring the scrapping of the embargo. There was a poll within Cuba, 97% of Cubans wanting better relations with the U.S., 73% of Americans wanting to reestablish diplomatic relations, 72% wanting to end the embargo. This was what people had wanted. Are you comfortable with this administration moving in a direction?
That's Cuban Americans. That is Cuban Americans also.
John, are you comfortable with this administration moving in the direction towards flushing all of that goodwill down the toilet?
First, I think that when you have a government that's engaging in subverting a democratic government in the region, which is what it has done in Venezuela, that is not acting in good faith in the region because it has a definite ideological agenda. When you talk about Raul Castro stepping down, he'll be stepping down from the post of president, but he'll be staying on as head of the Communist Party. And his son, Alejandro Castro, seems to be poised to be in a very important position, whether formally or informally. So we're talking a very brutal, totalitarian, communist dictatorship with an agenda of subverting other countries in the region. And Venezuela is a case in point that is taking place today, where there are thousands of Cuban troops on the ground, and what the Secretary of the Organization of American States has described as an occupying force.
Okay.
And I think subsidizing that is not in the interest of the United States, nor in the interest of the Venezuelan people or the Cuban people.
Okay, just enough time for Robert for a final response. Robert?
Yeah, I think the United States needs to have a very long look at its history, going right back to 1973 in Chile, when Salvador Allende was democratically elected. How did the United States respond? In the 1980s, in Nicaragua, how did the United States respond? In Venezuela right now, and in Cuba, the United States seems to think that it has the responsibility to enforce its doctrine, its way of doing things across that hemisphere, and it's unacceptable. And in the modern world, it's far better to talk with people, despite our differences. Nowhere is perfect, as you yourself said at the beginning of this interview, but it is far better to have dialogue, as President Obama and President Castro showed when they mutually agreed to normalise relations and open those embassies. What we're seeing now is a Trump and Rubio drive to turn us back to a Cold War anachronistic relationship between the two countries. And I think people in America, in the Cuban American community in America and across the world will be very, very saddened about that.
Okay, gentlemen. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but I have appreciated you both taking the time to talk to us on the Newsmakers. John Suarez and Robert Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.